Are you in a relationship with a nice guy? If so, listen up. Most people think that women lose respect for men because the man becomes mean, controlling, and selfish. And while this is sometimes true, in many relationships today, the opposite actually happens. And the man becomes more accommodating, more agreeable, and more careful not to upset anyone. And strangely, that is actually when the women start to lose respect. You see, this is when she stops asking for his opinion. She makes decisions without him, maybe even disregards him completely. She might describe him as a good guy, but knows that something in their relationship is missing, but she can't really put her finger on it. Eventually, the relationship starts to feel flat. And it's not because he was abusive or controlling, but because he was passive. Today, I want to talk about a dynamic that we can feel, but often fail to have words to explain. And that is why passivity in men often leads to a loss of respect and attraction in their relationships. The reason is much deeper than most people think, and it has everything to do with safety, polarity, and leadership. Before we get into this topic, I do want to clarify something. When people hear the phrase, women lose respect for passive men, it's easy to assume that women want the men to be aggressive or dominant and controlling, and that is not at all what I am suggesting. Passivity is actually not the opposite of aggression. The opposite of passivity is presence. What I'm talking about is something much deeper than behavior, though. I'm talking about how much of you is actually in the interaction. So let me explain. Passivity is not just about being nice. It is a pattern of self-withholding. So it often looks like not sharing what you really think, suppressing your preferences, avoiding disagreement in order to keep the peace, deferring decisions to other people, suppressing and minimizing your own needs. And underneath all of that is usually driven by a desire to avoid conflict. So it's like saying, I'm going to just remove myself from the moment to avoid any tension. That's why it feels easy in the moment, because you're not actually risking anything. But over time, your relationship will start to feel like something is missing, because it's actually missing you. For contrast, now let's discuss what presence means. Presence isn't loud or forceful or controlling. It's just being fully in a relationship without abandoning yourself. So that means that you have a point of view, that you know how to stay grounded during conflict. So it means that you can tolerate when somebody disagrees with you. You can be someone who's okay with being disappointed. You're all right with moments of awkwardness without trying to immediately fix it or escape it. It means that you can express yourself without being domineering or controlling. So you're not trying to dominate the other person, but you're also not disappearing or shrinking who you are in order to avoid conflict. So an example of this would be like, the passive response would be like, whatever you want is fine. The aggressive response would be, we're doing this, and that is the end of the story. Present means, this is what I'd prefer, but I'm also curious, what are your thoughts? That's completely different energy. It also means that you take up relational space. People can feel this, but they don't articulate it. Presence means that you exist in the relationship as the person that you really are, not just somebody who adapts to the current situation. So a man who is present actually has opinions, he makes decisions, he sets boundaries, and he can tolerate conflict. Those are important aspects of bringing the full presence of who you are into a relationship. And now that we have a solid definition of passivity and presence, let's talk about why a woman begins to lose respect for a passive man. When someone consistently avoids making decisions or avoiding conflict or taking a stance on something, the other person in the relationship begins to feel like they are the ones carrying the entire weight of the relationship alone. And the relationship becomes psychologically unbalanced. When that imbalance persists long enough, respect will start to deteriorate. And often it's not because someone intentionally wants it to, but because respect grows in the presence of strength and clarity. Respect isn't about being a good person. It's about feeling like the person you're with is consistent and competent and actually present when it matters most. So let me give you an example. Yes, it's a very simple, benign example, but nonetheless, it's an example. So there's a couple, and they're trying to decide where to go for dinner. So the woman says, "Where do you want to go?" The man responds, "Whatever you want." When she suggests something, he replies, "Perfect, that's fine." She asks again, "No, seriously, what do you want?" And again, he says, "Anything's good with me." Now, on the surface, that does look like he's just being polite and accommodating her. But internally, instead of feeling like she's with someone who has preferences and values and direction and opinions and presence, instead she starts to feel like she's dragging the relationship forward on her own. And after months or years of this pattern, she will eventually stop asking because she's given up on the idea of him providing leadership. And once that happens, it is likely that she will no longer feel attracted to him. And it has nothing to do with him being a bad man, but because passivity removes the sense of relational safety. To learn more about the importance of relational safety, you can watch my video titled, "What Happens When a Woman Doesn't Feel Safe with You?" which I'll link in the description, and I'll add it here. Now, there are two big psychological reasons passivity removes a woman's attraction. So let's talk about them. The first is safety. Women feel safest around men who demonstrate emotional stability and decisiveness. So when someone constantly avoids taking a stance or initiating conversations or avoiding hard topics, waiting for other people to make decisions, it creates a sense of instability and raises questions like, can this person really handle pressure? And can the person offer me the protection that I need in this relationship? And can this person even tolerate conflict? Passivity can look peaceful on the outside, but beneath is usually a buildup of suppression, unmet needs, and incredible frustration. Now, the second piece of this is something called polarity. If you've never heard of it, I will explain. Polarity is basically the energy created when two people show up as unique, grounded individuals instead of collapsing into sameness. You've likely heard of this concept in the saying, opposites attract. Most women are attracted to men who can stay emotionally steady when things aren't easy. Having opinions, leading the relationship, handling disagreement, all of those things create a sense of safety for a woman. When a man becomes passive, the tension and contrast that polarity offer disappear because he is accommodating rather than actually participating equally in the relationship. And this is where attraction fades, because attraction needs a small amount of tension to stay alive. Now, understanding why a man becomes passive is also equally as important. So let's talk about how that develops. Most passive men did not start out in the world that way. It was usually learned in childhood, and it develops from experiences where conflict led to punishment, or speaking up or for what they needed caused rejection. Connection with others depended on their level of agreeableness, or expressing needs led to shame and rejection. So their nervous system learned, the smaller I stay, the more connected I will be. That is an adaptation and coping strategy that was required of them in order to remain connected and to feel a sense of belonging. Most passive men learned early on in their childhood that if they stay agreeable, things will not only go more smoothly for them, but also make them more lovable. And I'll be damned, that strategy works. I mean, who doesn't love an agreeable, easygoing child? We're taught this even in schools. The problem is that this strategy only works temporarily in childhood. That is until he reaches adulthood and the strategy begins to interfere with real intimacy and connection in their relationships. Because intimacy requires two differentiated, authentic people. Here's the thing. Passivity does not actually preserve connection. It creates disconnection that is disguised as harmony. Because if you're not bringing your real self into the relationship, the connection isn't fully real. So over time, passivity actually leads to a lack of intimacy, a loss of polarity, less attraction, resentment, emotional distance. Underneath the facade of niceness, what you're actually dealing with is someone who is protecting themselves rather than connecting with you. And when you're in a relationship with a passive man, even though you might not be able to fully explain it, it can begin to feel like you can't rely on them. Here's why. Because when someone is primarily focused on avoiding discomfort or avoiding conflict or avoiding tension, you're always left wondering, well, what would happen when things actually get hard? Will they speak up? Will they take a stand for something, for anything? Will they be honest even if it creates tension, or will they run from it? And just that question alone creates distrust. Not because they're unsafe in the obvious physical way, but because something about their presence doesn't feel solid, grounded, and reliable. It's hard to fully trust someone who is constantly adjusting themselves to avoid discomfort, because you're never quite sure who you're actually with. So what does the alternative look like? Let's talk about it. Healthy masculine presence looks like having opinions, making decisions, expressing your preferences, tolerating disagreement, and staying emotionally steady when tension shows up. For example, in the dinner scenario I mentioned earlier, instead of saying whatever you want, a grounded response might be, I'm really in the mood for Italian tonight, but if you want something else, I'm open to it. It's clear, it's simple, that is presence. That kind of communication creates mutual respect in a relationship. Now, if you've watched any of my other videos, you'll notice that this pattern of passivity shows up in many relational dynamics. For example, in my video titled Why You Can't Change Someone, I discussed how relationships deteriorate when one person takes all the responsibility for the emotional environment. And in my video, Double-Bind Communication, the pattern that makes you doubt yourself, I explained how confusing communication dynamics emerge when people avoid direct expression. Passivity feeds both of those patterns and easily distorts relationship. Because here's the thing, when clarity disappears, trust is what follows. Because what looks like peace on the surface is often just self-abandonment underneath. So what I want to leave you with is not men need to dominate. That would be a complete serious misunderstanding. But the real takeaway here is that attraction and respect grow in the presence of authenticity and grounded individuality. Two people, two perspectives, and two voices. Because when a person abandons themselves into accommodation and self-preservation, the relationship loses tension. And without tension, relationships lose vitality, attraction, and respect. If you recognize yourself in this pattern, I want you to know that this does not mean you've done something wrong. It just means you learned a strategy that once protected you. But the strategy that once kept you safe in childhood is going to keep you disconnected in your adult relationships. Real intimacy requires the courage to show up as a full person. And that starts when you stop disappearing, when you bring your voice, your preferences, your boundaries, all of you into the relationship. Because respect doesn't grow from being easy to be with. It grows from being real. And when that happens, respect doesn't have to be demanded or earned. It just naturally follows. Because you're finally showing up as someone who can be known.